Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The Infirmary, which is a production of Campfire Endurance Coaching, where it is my job every time that I do one of these shows to either talk to somebody in the endurance world or have a monologue show just like this one, where what I try to do is dispel some of the myths around a certain topic or something like that. And today we are going to be talking about heat training, which is a very important and incredibly misunderstood topic in endurance sports. And so I hope that today is going to clear up some of the misconceptions out there and give you some strategies as to how you can actually incorporate heat training into your training cycles. So, one of the big reasons I'm doing this one is because I hear things like, I'm just going to go to the race early and I'll do my workouts in the hot part of the day, and I'm sure I will acclimate and I will get ready for the race that way. This doesn't work. Heat training is a lot like altitude training. You have to periodize it throughout your training season, and you really have to put in blocks where you're going to be working effectively on heat training in a focused way and not just leave it towards the end, because you aren't going to adapt if you go and try to do your acclimation. Even if you go to the race site 2 to 3 weeks early, it's not going to get you what you might think it's going to get you. And we're going to talk about why that is later. But I do have an example. So this past weekend was Oregon 70.3, which is sometimes a hot race. This year it was sort of more mild. It was kind of high 70s, some pretty good racing conditions. And one of the athletes that I work with, who isn't really focusing on triathlon this year, they are focusing a lot more on marathons. And this was more of a, I want to do this as a community event. This is fun. I enjoy seeing these other people. So this race wasn't a huge focus for this particular athlete. I'm saying a lot of this stuff because I don't want you to think that this athlete kind of made a mistake or anything like that. But the week before the race, they went to Mexico for a family vacation. Very hot. July, Mexico, ocean, humidity, all that stuff. And instead of acclimating by spending a week in Mexico, they got back to the race and they just felt exhausted and their legs were really, really off on race day. And that is what's going to happen if you try to go to your race 7 to 10 days early without having done any heat training. You're just going to deplete, and then on race day, you're not going to perform your best. Because one of the key drivers of heat training is dehydration and heat stress and all of this stuff, and that will leave you tired. So if you don't take anything else from this particular episode, one of the things that I really hope you hear is that you cannot skip your heat training and then go to your race, even if you go early, 7 to 10 days, maybe even like 2 or 3 weeks. You can't do that and expect to acclimate effectively. So that's the first big takeaway. The next thing I want to tell you, though, is that everybody gets this wrong. The study we're going to talk about today, and I'm going to tell you about it in just a few minutes when we get going. But one of the most important details, I think, they looked at the 2015 World Track and Field Championships, which were in China, and very, very hot location. Only 15% of all of the athletes assembled for the World Championships had any kind of heat training or heat, either chronic, which means beforehand, or acute, which means some kind of strategy that you do right before the race or during the race, like a ice vest or ice slurries or things like that. Those are more acute, and we're not going to talk about those too much today. But only 15% of the athletes, professional athletes at a world championships, had attended to doing some heat training. So you're not alone. And the other big reason I'm doing this is over the past 5-8 years or so, heat training has become another one of these like hot button issues in the endurance world. Like it's a new big thing or anything like that. Heat training has been around forever, and it is getting lumped in with stuff like high intensity interval training, sprint intensity training, ketones, polarized training, time crunched, all of this stuff. These are parts of the endurance world where the industry is sort of trying to make a concept overly complicated, which means that they can charge you money to make it less complicated. So here today, we are going to make it less complicated for free. Okay, So, what are we actually trying to do when we are doing heat training? So, whenever you're doing any kind of training, there's kind of a three-part thing that happens. First, there's the stimulus, and let's talk about this from a training perspective, we want to improve our VO2 max or something like that. So there's a stimulus, and in this case, it would be a particular workout where you're doing VO2 max intervals. That stimulus then leads to some kind of signaling response in your physiology. And this is where things get really gnarly and complicated and scientific and everything like that. So we're not going to dive into signaling and whatnot, but we go stimulus, signal, and then adaptation, which is the thing that we are after. We want more adaptations that will take us in the direction of the performance we want, and we want fewer adaptations that take us away from the performance that we want. Believe it or not, a lot of the time, athletes are doing workouts or doing things that are taking them away from the direction of the performance that they are looking for. And obviously, that's not what we want to accomplish, which is what we're here today to talk about. So, in this particular case, the stimulus is going to be some sort of heat exposure that gets your core temperature up to around 38.5 degrees Celsius. A lot of the time, your resting internal temperature is going to be around 37 degrees Celsius. And, for most of us that speak in Fahrenheit, yeah, that's our usual 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, that sort of thing. Yes, there is definitely some individual variation. Some people run a little hot, some people run a little cold, but in general, going to be around 37 degrees Celsius. And what we are trying to do is get your core temperature through heat exposure up to 38.5 degrees Celsius and hold it there. We're going to talk a little bit later about the fact that more heat is not necessarily better. Got a little sidebar about that coming up. And then what are the adaptations that come from that stimulus and then the signal that results from the stimulus? This is a big list. And if you pay attention to physiology and training and stuff like this, if you listen to this list, you are going to probably instantly get up from wherever you're going and go get in a sauna or something like this, because this list is amazing. These are things that we really, really want. So here are the adaptations that we can expect if we are doing our heat training effectively. So first of all, blood plasma goes up. What's blood plasma? It is the non-red blood cell portion of your blood. Red blood cells, the little inner tube shaped things, they're red. They need a medium in which to move through your body. If they don't have fluid, they just turn into a scab, and that's really bad. You don't want your blood clotting while it's inside your body. So plasma is water and vitamins and a whole bunch of other things, but it's basically anything that's non-red blood cells. And if you have more blood plasma, you basically have a larger internal lake in your body. And if there's more water in your body, then you're going to dehydrate slower. But then the other big thing that happens is, if you go back to, earth sciences in middle school or something like that, you might remember specific temperature, which states that a larger body of water takes more time to both heat up and cool down. So if you do have a bigger lake inside, it is going to slow the increase of your core temperature, which on race day is gold. Okay, so number one, blood plasma goes up. Don't worry, I'm not going to do as much of a explanation of all the rest of these, but blood plasma going up is really big. Blood volume will also go up. So that's total volume of your blood. That's always good. That's going to improve your performance. Your sweat rate is going to increase, and you're going to start sweating earlier. Now, some people might be like, wait, that's bad. That's going to dehydrate me more. Actually, no. If we're trying to stay cool, more sweat is better, and early sweat is better, because that's going to get us into that evaporative cooling effect, where if we have sweat on our skin and we are moving through a relatively dry environment, then that sweat is going to evaporate, and that helps cool our body. We need to address very humid environments, because if you just sweat and it's really humid, that sweat will just stay on your skin, and that is not great. That just sort of forms not a vapor barrier, but a liquid barrier that insulates you, and that could actually make you hotter. This is one of the reasons why athletes are always dousing themselves with water in races. The exposure to the cold water doesn't actually do anything in terms of heat mitigation, but what it does is it gets the sweat off of your body, and then you can dry off a little bit, and that's going to keep going with the evaporative cooling. Perceptual heat stress goes down. So if you do heat training and racing in the heat feels easier. That's great. Stroke volume goes up. So the amount of blood that your heart pumps with each beat goes up. That's really good. Because of that, VO2 max can go up. Your anaerobic threshold shifts to the right on a graph of intensity. That's really good. Muscular force goes up. Carbohydrate utilization goes down. Lactate concentration goes down. Gut permeability improves. That means that you can absorb fluids and food better. GI distress as a result goes down. Evaporative cooling improves. We already talked about that a little bit. These are all incredibly important adaptations. And this is one of the reasons why heat training recently has gotten, maybe a little bit more important than altitude training. Heat training is also usually easier to accomplish. You don't need an altitude tent. You don't need to go to altitude. You don't need to vary your altitude. Yeah, there are logistical concerns to heat training, but a little easier than altitude training. So our study today, so that I hope gets out of the way why we are doing this podcast today and why you're going to be doing heat training. That's a huge host of positive adaptations. So our study is called, quote, Heat Alleviation Strategies for Athletic Performance, a Review and Practitioner Guidelines. It was published in the very aptly named journal Temperature in early 2020. And our authors are Oliver Gibson, Carl James, Jessica Mee, Ashley Wilmot, Gareth Turner, Mark Hayes, and Neil Maxwell. It is a meta-analysis, which means they didn't actually design and execute a study themselves. They examined a big group of previous studies, and they're trying to draw some bigger picture consensus from it. So, okay, why did they do it? As pointed out above, only 15% of the athletes who went to the 2015 World Championships did any kind of heat training. And this article came out in early 2020, just before COVID hit. And it was anticipating that the Tokyo Olympics would happen later that year, which of course they didn't happen until 2021. And what they were hoping was this was going to give practitioners and coaches and athletes a real good blueprint of how to prepare for Tokyo. And it probably still did. And those coaches and athletes just had a much longer timeline to accomplish that, which, is obviously great. The authors discovered, and the reason I'm putting this in here is because I think that you will also recognize this in your own existence, that a barrier to the implementation of strategies arises from an array of logistical issues or being unable to interpret contradictions and ambiguities in the scientific literature effectively. Okay, what does that mean? That means that professional track athletes are just as confused as you are about how to pull this off and how to do it effectively. All of this stuff, like triathlon and endurance sports, are already complicated sports. And if we're going to add in heat training, do I do it in a sauna? Do I do it in a hot tub? Do I need to do it actively? Can I do it passively? How much of it? How long? It's a pretty thorny topic. And so that's one of the reasons why these authors tried to do it, and why I'm talking about it here is because we want to dispel these logistical issues and really help you come up with a simple plan that you're going to be able to implement in your training, whether you're a coach or an athlete. So the study looked at a few different things. They looked at acute and chronic techniques. So acute are things that you'll do on race day. Ice vests, ice slurries during competition, things like that. We're not going to talk about that too much today. We're going to talk about the heat training aspect, which is the chronic part. So that's long-term heat exposure during preparation. And the study looked at a few different techniques of doing that. So there's exercising outside in naturally hot environments. That's called acclimatization. Then we can do exercising or passively doing heat work in saunas and hot tubs. That's called acclimation. There's a difference. Acclimatization is when you are doing the work outside, like doing your training in a naturally hot environment. Acclimation is when you are using a not artificial, but a created environment like a sauna or a hot tub or something like that. So quick sidebar about the difference between acclimatization and acclimation. Seems that their findings are roughly similar, but no studies have directly compared the efficacy of both of them. So more research is needed in that topic. Obviously, both have logistical problems. If you live in a temperate place, you're not living in a naturally hot environment, so you're probably going to have to do more acclimation. If you live in a hot environment, but you don't have access to like saunas or hot tubs, you might have to do more acclimatization. But again, since we don't really have much literature on the subject, both are considered pretty effective. Sport doesn't seem to matter, the authors found out, though they also point out that sports that you can do in one place, like being on a bike trainer, does seem to be a little easier and a little more effective, even than like running on a treadmill in a hot environment, because they do point out that running is hard and it's a little bit easier if you're doing something non-weight bearing, like riding your trainer, being on a rowing machine, something like that. So, okay, now what are the actual strategies that they examined? So we're going to talk about this for a few minutes here. So, settle in. So the first, and I'm going to talk about these in sort of the order that they thought were the most effective. And the first one is called isothermic. And so what they did with an isothermic strategy is 30 minutes of active heat stress. So you are exercising in a hot environment at around 70% of VO2 max. That's going to be roughly tempo-ish, like high endurance tempo, maybe creeping into sweet spot a little bit, something like that. Endurance athletes or triathletes, we're kind of talking Ironman intensity, maybe creeping up towards 70.3 intensity, something like that. So 30 minutes of that at 70% of VO2 max, followed by 60 minutes of passive work. So sitting in a sauna, going to a hot tub after you're doing your 30 minutes. They discovered during this point that really 38.5 degrees is the number we want. There's no additional benefit discovered by going up to like 39 degrees and above. So triathletes, you are always thinking more is better. More is not better in this case. We want to aim for 38.5 degrees. How are we measuring that in your home? Well, there are devices out there. Core has a pretty good body temperature monitor, but you could go whole hog and pick yourself up a rectal thermometer and, start doing some samples. You probably don't need to do that much. If you are exercising in a hot environment and you're following these strategies, you don't need to verify. So that's isothermic, 30 minutes at around 70% of VO2 max, followed by 60 minutes of just sitting in a hot tub or a sauna or something like that, more passive work. Next is called fixed, where you're riding or running or exercising at around 50% of VO2 max for about 90 minutes in a hot environment. Both isothermic and fixed seem to deliver about the same result. And that fixed protocol, that goes all the way back to a study that Santiago Lorenzo did at the University of Oregon. Woohoo! Go Ducks! Right here in my home state, where what they did was 10 days of 90 minutes at 50% of VO2 max in a 100-degree room at 30% humidity. Those athletes did that protocol for 10 days in addition to their regular training, and they showed some incredible benefits from doing that particular protocol. So that's a really good example of the fixed strategy. The study, this meta-analysis, found that there's really no difference in the results that you get between isothermic and fixed, but they pointed out that depending on what you're aiming for, the isothermic might more directly mimic what you're going to experience on race day. And so they kind of give isothermic a slight edge because they point out that you're going to perceive that it's more like your race day. And that is perception is reality. And so if you are a little bit more used to doing race intensity in a hot environment, isothermic might get a slight edge. But again, really no big difference in the actual outcomes. They also examined passive strategies, which is just getting into a sauna, getting into a hot tub. And what they noted is that if you only do this alone, you're actually not going to see very much benefit. And so what they suggest to do is that you either do these passive strategies before or after a workout, because your core temperature is going to be elevated by that workout. And so you can preheat or post heat or both. That would probably be really good, where you are going to be, not moving, not exercising. But if you kind of combine the heat stress with a workout, you get a pretty good response. It's not as good as the isothermic or the fixed intensity active strategies. But again, we really want to talk about the fact that this stuff can be logistically difficult. So whatever you have access to is probably going to help. If you're curious, the best response in this particular strategy of this passive, so maybe you go do a swim, the best response came from 30 minutes of hot water immersion after a workout. And for hot water, they say 40 degrees Celsius. That's pretty hot. 30 minutes of sitting in a hot tub after a workout can be pretty intense, so you might need to work yourself up to it. And then finally, the study also looked at the additional clothing idea where you just kind of bundle up and do your training that way, which is what athletes in more temperate environments or without access to saunas or places where they can set up their bike trainer in a hot room have done for a long time. Sadly, this doesn't seem to work. So if this is a strategy that you have employed or are planning to employ, I'm sorry to tell you, it's probably not going to be doing too much for you. So recapping the section, the isothermic and fixed strategies where you're doing about 90 minutes of a block, and isothermic is 30 minutes active and 60 minutes passive, all in a hot environment. And then fixed is 90 minutes active, but at a lower intensity. Those are your two best options. And then your next best option is to pre or post heat around a workout or both using a sauna or a hot tub to get the effect that we want. Okay. How long on a big picture scale and how long on a small picture scale? And so by big picture, I'm talking about, do we do this for days? Do we do this for weeks? And small picture, we're talking about, do we do it for minutes or we do it for hours? This one is a big can of worms. So I am going to try to summarize this as best I can. The study found that intervention of 5 days or less can be good, but they are generally going to leave some adaptations on the table, and it is less effective for women to do these short-term only 5-day applications. And we're going to talk a little bit about the sex difference in a little bit. Longer term interventions, which is, 10 days or longer, get you all of the adaptations, but there is a diminishing returns period. And the authors point out that if you do this all the time, you're going to be very dehydrated. And that's obviously not good. That's going to hurt your training that is done outside of this heat training modality. So what the authors suggest is that you should use between little blocks of between 5 and 10 days that are separated by some maintenance weeks where you only do a little bit of heat training. And we're going to get into like a whole look at how you can do this as a long-term strategy later. But that's sort of the way that we're going to do it. We're going to periodize it a little bit more the way that we would do our normal training, or we would do going to altitude. So then, as we pointed out above, sessions should always be between 30 minutes and 90 minutes, though those longer sessions, if you're not doing the fixed intensity of 50% of VO2 max for 90 minutes, those longer sessions should always involve some passive heating. And that also the study notes, and we already talked about this a little bit, that if the session is only 30 minutes of just passive work where it's not connected to a workout, that doesn't seem to have much effectiveness. So you can't just go and sit in a sauna and think that you're doing your heat training. You need to couple it with a workout, or best picture, do some active heat training as part of your strategy. Okay, next difference. This meta-analysis, this study, very nicely points out the usual unfairness in study design, which is the fact that almost all of these studies, the subjects are usually men. 80 to 90% of the research studies are men. This is frustrating and it needs to change. And it's especially pointed in this particular case because a lot of women and a lot of female athletes might be on oral contraception, which does raise your core temperature a few tenths of a degree, maybe 0.3 degrees Celsius, which is a lot. Remember, If we are aiming for 38.5 degrees and we hang out at 37 degrees, that's a fifth of the way there already. And during the high hormone phase, the luteal phase of a woman's cycle, core temperature is going to be elevated also. So what the authors do, and they do, some usual caveats that talking about sex different in sport can be a little bit of a landmine. So they sort of dance around the subject a little bit. But that short-term interventions, so if you're only doing 5 days, are going to leave a lot of these adaptations on the table for women. And so what they suggest is that women should be usually aiming for slightly longer blocks, more in the 10-day range, and that women need a little bit more time of the particular heat training session. So if you're doing the preheat or post-heat and you're a female-bodied person, you might need to add a little bit of time to your sauna or your hot tub session. You might need to do, instead of 90 minutes of like a fixed intensity work application, you might need to do more like 115 to 120 minutes. If you're doing the isothermic approach, with 30 minutes active and then 60 minutes passive, you might need to extend that as well. So ladies, I'm sorry. Maybe I'm not sorry. This does mean you get to hang out in saunas and hot tubs a little bit more, which can be nice, but you do need a little bit more of this response. It's not sure why, but that seems to be what the research is pointing out in terms of how you need to approach this slightly differently than your male-bodied counterparts. Okay, we are up to part 3. So how can you apply this in an effective and useful way? I said we weren't going to talk about chronic and acute, but I want to cycle back here just a little bit. So remember, acute is doing heat alleviation strategies the day of the race. So ice vests and ice slurries and things like that. Chronic is what we have been talking about for, the last 30 minutes or so. The study points out that just acute, so if you're going to a race and you're like, I'm not going to do that heat training, I'll just wear my ice vest before my race, that's not going to get you very far. And in fact, actually could make things quite a bit worse as your body is cooled and then is like, what the hell is going on? It's really hot out. And so you really, really do need to do both of them. But the study also goes on to say that if you are only going to pick one, chronic will really do much better work over the long term than acute. And this makes sense, right? If you're doing chronic heat training work over 16 weeks, you are definitely going to become better in the heat. The study points out or notices that if you want to do your heat training on consecutive days, so day after day. You don't want to leave gaps in between your heat days. So if you're doing an approach where you're doing saunaing, on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, that might not actually help you very much. So you should do your heat work over consecutive days, probably 4 days in a row, maybe up to 5. Or this is another nice way to kind of hack this or get around. There is just as much efficacy of doing twice daily heat acclimation, so 2 of these sessions per day over 4 days with a day in between. Obviously, this can be logistically challenging, but if you're a multi-sport athlete and you are already doing multiple workouts per day, you can very easily do something where like you go do your swim and then you do some post-swim heating, and then maybe later in the day you're doing a bike ride and you can do some of that. If it's hot out, you can do it out in the heat, or you can do a heat session on the bike. And this way you can kind of like batch your heat work and get as much effect as 4 consecutive days with 4 days of twice daily with a day break in between. So what does this look like in practice? So the 4 consecutive days, let's just go like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. That's good. But doing the twice daily, you would do 2 sessions on Monday, take a break on Tuesday, 2 sessions on Wednesday, take a break on Thursday, and then maybe get back to it on Friday, that kind of thing as well. So both of those are really good. But if you're only doing once a day heat training, don't leave breaks in between. How long will it last? So the effects seem to last up to 2 weeks, but you can prolong the effectiveness by doing maintenance weeks where you only do 1 session a week. This is really, really good news. This means that you can start your heat training really early in your training cycle for your next big race, you can get the bulk of the stimulus out of the way early when you might not be doing as much specific work for your goal race, maybe during like your endurance block or something like that. And then you can just keep the effects around by doing some maintenance work. This is like such a great finding from this particular study. This is the one that I think I'm most excited about because it means that we can shift this stressful approach, because heat training is stressful, earlier in the training cycle when intensity of our other workouts might be a little lower. Remember, a coach's job is to manage fatigue. And if we're doing high intensity workouts and we're doing heat training, oof, that's a tough block. So the study actually outlines a very, very helpful 16-week model, and I'm just going to walk you through it right now. Don't worry, I will put a link to the study in the show notes, and if you're watching this on video, I'm going to toss up a little picture of the figure that we're looking at. Podcast land, I will put a picture in the show notes as well. So this is a 16-week block. You're going to start with 2 weeks of 5 days in a row of once a day heat training. So what that looks like, let's just think about this as your heat work week. So 16 weeks out and 15 weeks out, Monday through Friday, you are going to do your once a day heat training. Then you are going to do 2 weeks of only one time a week maintenance. So this is weeks 3 and 4. You're just doing one session a week. Then you do another work week, so another 5 days of heat acclimation once a day. Then you get 3 weeks of once a week heat maintenance. We're already halfway through the block. We are already 8 weeks in. Then we're going to shift to some twice daily heat acclimation, 3 times a week. So let's say it's Monday, Wednesday, Friday, with 1 day off of heat acclimation in between on Tuesday, Thursday, and then your weekend off as well. We go back to 2 more weeks of once a week of maintenance, another week of that twice daily intervention, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 2 heat sessions per day. Then we go 3 weeks of once a week maintenance. And then we're only like 9 or 10 days away from your goal race. Then it's time to go and get to your race, experience the acclimatization of being at the race site in the heat, and we are through. And if you are able to hit that schedule, you are going to really experience a much more successful race day. Your perceptual sense of the heat is going to be much lower. So the heat is not going to seem as oppressive. And then all of those huge benefits that we talked about earlier are just going to make you a much stronger athlete. Little final detail here as we kind of begin to wrap up. That study that I mentioned, that 2008 Santiago Lorenzo study at the University of Oregon, they did a little thing where they not only tested their results in hot environments, they also tested them in temperate environments. And so say you're planning to go to a hot race and then lo and behold you show up and it's like for some reason it's like 65 degrees and overcast. All of this work is going to make you a super athlete. You get benefits in temperate environments as well as hot environments. And that should be obvious, right? All of those adaptations that we talked about earlier, those are the adaptations that we want in training anyway. And so, of course, if your VO2 max is better, of course, if your anaerobic threshold has shifted to the right, all of these things are going to make you a better athlete and temperate as well. And this, I think, is really the reason why heat training has emerged as a superior intervention than altitude training, not just logistically, but also out of the performance benefits that we get from it. So I hope this was helpful. I know this was probably just a lot of blasted information that's just coming right at you. As always, if you want to talk more about this, there's a link in the show notes. You can book a free training analysis with me, and we can talk about how to apply heat training to your own training. We are coming up on the hot period of when I am adding athletes to my roster for next year. I've got a few spots right now, so if you want to get to the front of the line, which usually does fill up in September, then this is a great time to contact me and we can talk about heat training and we can talk about how to implement this in your training for the end of 2025 and all of 2026. But as always, thank you so much for taking some time today and listening to this and learning how you can improve your own training without paying hundreds and thousands of dollars to the endurance industry that, wants to make these topics arcane and difficult so that they can charge you money for it. That's always my goal here, is to provide free information that makes you a better endurance athlete. Thanks for visiting the Infirmary. I hope that you are leaving feeling better.